where people would buy raffle and 50-50 tickets, bid at the Chinese auction and open auction, and buy baked goods and food and listen to music, as we so often see at fundraisers. All the expectations of the organizers were surpassed when, on the November 29th day, hundreds of people came to the benefit and a total of $31,050 was raised. I want to congratulate the organizers on such a successful day. I also want to recognize the little and big things that people do every day to help others. Thank you.
I want to thank all of the members for those fantastic member statements this morning. As we get ready for oral questions put by members to ministers, we'll look forward to the opening question from the Leader of the Official Opposition, who can stand up now.
Is for the Premier. Mr. Speaker, despite the repeated expensive apologies from the Premier, seniors across this province remain very concerned about the future of their pharmacare program. They know the government already tried to jack up their premiums, in many cases by as much as 200%. Who knows what will eventually happen when the next wave of changes come, Mr. Speaker. Premier has promised that seniors will be consulted before more changes come, and I'll quote that they'll be consulted from one end of the province to the other. I will table that. I'd like to ask the Premier, it's been 2 months since he made that commitment. When will these seniors' consultations start?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. They're beginning the process now through the Department of Health and Wellness, Mr. Speaker. I again want to thank those seniors who across the province who responded to the pharmacare changes with a very thoughtful approach, a respectful approach. Pointed out an issue that that had come up, that we had actually solved the problem for a group of seniors, Mr. Speaker, but we had created another problem in the program. I thank them for pointing that out, Mr. Speaker, and like I believe everyone should expect their Premier to do when he's wrong, to apologize for that and work towards a better solution for all Nova Scotians.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the issue is that the government continues to make announcements about the pharmacare program without consulting with seniors. Just yesterday, the Minister of Health said there would be no new additions to the formulary, the list of medicines that seniors can have access to. Mr. Speaker, that statement was made without consulting seniors. It was almost like a threat that until this is changed, they'll get nothing new, Mr. Speaker. Many seniors have told us across the province they don't mind paying a little more as long as they get access to the medicines that they need. So, Mr. Speaker, it's been 2 months since the Premier committed to making a public consultation with seniors. They're still thinking about when that might start. I'd like to ask the Premier, will he produce a schedule of the consultations, including where and when they will be held, so that seniors can get ready to tell the government what they think of the pharmacare changes?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I want to inform him that any changes to the pharmacare takes place on April 1, Mr. Speaker. As he knows, we're past that date. It'll be next year. We're in the process now of working through the Department of Health, dealing with seniors across this province. And I want to ensure the honourable member, I will take out an ad and make sure every senior knows when those meetings are going to be.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, seniors are going to have to pay yet again. They had to pay the first time around by as much as 200%. They had to pay for their apology. Now they have to pay to find out when the consultations are going to be, Mr. Speaker. No wonder they've lost trust in the government, Mr. Speaker, because we can only wonder what would have happened if they just told seniors what they were thinking of doing by consulting them in the first place, Mr. Speaker. But this is a government that acts first and it consults later. And we have no greater example of that than the film industry, who were promised after-the-fact consultations, and yet they're still waiting for help, Mr. Speaker, as their industry sinks and sinks. Mr. Speaker, I'd just like to ask the Premier, how can seniors trust his government this time when it has such an awful history of consulting after the fact?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the honourable member for the question. As he knows, there was consultation leading up to the changes, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, when we had talked to seniors groups across the province, we had identified an issue that there were a group of seniors, low-income seniors, that were having to make a very difficult choice between medication, Mr. Speaker, or food. We think that's inappropriate. In fixing that problem, Mr. Speaker, we shifted it unintentionally. When it was pointed out to us, Mr. Speaker, we corrected that. We made sure that low-income seniors, Mr. Speaker, have been protected under this program, that they will not be having to make the choice that they were making under former governments, deciding whether or not to buy medication or food. We believe that's a good thing. We've also committed to seniors across this province to further engage them on what the pharmacare program looks like going forward.
The Honourable In-House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Premier. Many Nova Scotians are concerned that this government is about to pursue short-term revenue gain by privatizing the registries. Yesterday, in an article published by All Nova Scotia, the Minister of Service, Nova Scotia, said he needs to bring the issue back before his fellow ministers for a final decision. I will table that. Well, Mr. Speaker, the minister cannot have it both ways. If an issue of this magnitude is going to be in the budget, certainly the decision has already been made. My question to the Premier is, which is it? Will we see a decision on the registries in the budget, or does the decision still need to go back to Cabinet? The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, every decision that government makes doesn't have to be in the budget. I want to tell the honourable member, this is an important question. One of the challenges of governing is that every time you have an opportunity to look at the way a service is delivered or a program, the opposition end up creating a whole bunch of fear among employees and among citizen groups, when in actual fact we believe it's healthy to look at these programs to see, are they achieving the outcomes or the service delivery that Nova Scotians expect. We've been working along, Mr. Speaker. We've been working along, Mr. Speaker, with our employees in Service Nova Scotia. I want to thank them for the dedication and commitment they've continued to make to Nova Scotians as we've walked through this process with them. And, Mr. Speaker, before I stand on the House and communicate it to the honourable member, I think it would be appropriate for us to have a conversation with our employees.
The Honourable In-House Leader for the New Democratic Party on her first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the NDP caucus has spoken with many stakeholders who use the registry, and those stakeholders have spoken to their counterparts in other provinces where registry privatization has taken place. Everyone we met told us that the experience in other provinces has been one of increased cost and a degradation of service. So my question for the Premier is this. Surely his government has also met with the stakeholders, and what are these stakeholders telling the government?
The Honourable Premier.
I want to thank the honourable member for the question. Of course, we've met with stakeholders, Mr. Speaker. We've met with our employees. We've had an ongoing conversation. We've looked at an analysis of what the service delivery model looks like, what's in the best interest of our employees and all Nova Scotians. Mr. Speaker, that information is being gathered, and we'll communicate that to our employees. But again, I want to thank the men and women who work across this province in Service Nova Scotia, delivering services to citizens in one community, in every community across this province in such a thoughtful, professional way, and we continue to look forward to working with them.
The Honourable In-House Leader for the New Democratic Party on her final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians have paid $800,000 for consultants to give advice to the government about the registries. Taxpayers are no doubt wondering, what kind of advice do you get for such a high cost? So my question for the Premier is, when will his government make public the report prepared by these consultants concerning the registries? The
Honourable Premier.
I want to thank the honourable member for the question. As I said to the honourable member in my first question, all the information is being gathered. It'll be put together, Mr. Speaker. We'll communicate a decision to our employees before we communicate it to members of this House.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of the great sadnesses of the pharmacare debacle of the government is that they were perfectly okay with letting 8,000 to 15,000 seniors drop out of the program and go without the medicines that they need. The government's own report, entitled Seniors Pharmacare Program Remodel, shows that they expected somewhere between 8,000 and 15,000 seniors would leave the program because of the premium hike, and I'll table that, Mr. Speaker. I want to know from the Premier, why was it okay with him that so many thousands of seniors would go without the medicines that they need?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I believe the honourable member is reading that information inappropriately. What he's referring to is that potentially, Mr. Speaker, if there were a change in premium at any time in our history, there are seniors who would make the determination whether or not they would stay within the program or whether or not they would go buy private services. Mr. Speaker, they would not go without medication, Mr. Speaker. I think it's inappropriate of the honourable member to suggest otherwise. The fact that changes are making sure that seniors wouldn't go without medication. It is low-income seniors, Mr. Speaker, who we were trying to protect, who couldn't afford to go buy private insurance, Mr. Speaker. That, I believe, is the responsibility of government to look after our most vulnerable citizens, and this government is going to continue to do so.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
No, Mr. Speaker. No, we are not reading it inappropriately. The government produced the report itself. Its officials said clearly the day it was presented that they expected somewhere between 8,000 and 15,000 seniors would go without. Hopefully some of them would find another option, but clearly many would not because they can't afford it. That is the point. So if 8,000 is not acceptable, how many thousands of seniors was the Premier prepared to see go without the medicines they need if that's not the number?
The Honourable Premier.
Again, Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for his question. Again, he's reading the information wrong. The fact of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, if a senior was going to leave the program, it was because they were going to go buy private insurance. The changes we were making was to ensure that vulnerable citizens of this province, Mr. Speaker, were being looked after. We're going to continue to do so, Mr. Speaker, to make sure that vulnerable citizens of this province get the medication they need, get the education they require, Mr. Speaker, make sure they get the housing they look after, Mr. Speaker, and we're going to continue to provide good government, Mr. Speaker, and making sure that every citizen of this province is treated appropriately.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Labour and Advanced Education. Mr. Speaker, a movement is growing across Canada and the U.S. To raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. And today marks the International Day of Action for the Fight for 15. Low-wage income earners struggle to make ends meet and must make difficult decisions between feeding their children and heating their homes. Most affected by these low wages are women, Mr. Speaker, and as a result of that, children are left vulnerable. Mr. Speaker, in Nova Scotia, we know that 40% of children in poverty live in a family with at least one full-time, full-year earner. So my question to the Minister, given these troubling statistics, does the Minister think raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour is worth examination?
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the honourable member for the question. The minimum wage rate impacts the lives of many Nova Scotians and businesses, both directly and indirectly. And I would encourage employers to pay more than the minimum wage if they can do that. But we know that not all businesses can do that. It's important to balance the needs of the community as well as the business community. A significant increase in the minimum wage can actually end up hurting employees because, in fact, businesses don't hire. And in fact, the last time we saw large increases in the minimum wage, I heard from a lot of businesses that had difficulty with that. I want to assure the honourable member that this government will be taking steps in the coming budget to make life more affordable for Nova Scotians.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We all understand that there will always be exceptions to the $15 minimum wage, and that in some circumstances is unrealistic. But that shouldn't deter the minister from taking action where appropriate. Nova Scotia currently has the second lowest wages overall in Canada, and it's hurting our economy. In a report issued by the CCPA, it found that stagnation of overall wages has contributed to holding back Canada's economy. So we hear that economic stimulus should take a priority right now. I'd like to ask the minister, does the minister agree that raising the wages of Nova Scotians is a way to boost our provincial economy?
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
I want to thank the honourable member for his question once again, and I would like to point out to him that, in fact, Nova Scotia has the highest minimum wage in the Atlantic provinces, Mr. Speaker. And I'd also like to remind the honourable member that when the minimum wage was last reviewed, or the formula was last reviewed, I should say, was in 2011 under his government. And they came up with a formula for increasing the minimum wage. So he would know that every year the minimum wage is reviewed in this province. It's reviewed by a committee that's made up of equal members from Labour and employers, and we will be taking our advice from them. Thank you very much.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Premier. You know, Mr. Speaker, the Premier likes to talk about how he wants Nova Scotia to be the most open and transparent government in Canada. Whatever happened to that, Mr. Speaker? Whatever happened to that idea? He signed a deal with Bay Ferries that contains a secret guaranteed profit, the management fee of the company, even though it's funded by the taxpayers of Nova Scotia, remains a secret, Mr. Speaker. So will the Premier now actually do something open and transparent and tell the taxpayers of Nova Scotia how much that management fee that they're paying for is?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the honourable member. I want to thank all those members of the public service who've helped the government move to an open data process, Mr. Speaker. We're moving and putting data out there so that businesses across this province can access that information. One of the few in the country to do so, Mr. Speaker. Looking forward to continuing to see the innovation that businesses are going to drive from that information to create economic opportunities to drive job growth, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that this place not only continues to lead Atlantic Canada, Mr. Speaker, but I would dare say after next Tuesday, the rest of the country will be looking at the good fiscal management of this province.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's too bad that job growth doesn't include a few jobs on the ferry itself, even though the taxpayers of Nova Scotia are contributing $100 million over 10 years to pay for it, Mr. Speaker. But you know, the Premier had lots of things to say when he was running for the office of Premier. He once said, "We all saw what happened when the previous government, that would be the NDP, continued to write check after check after check with no job guarantee to the people of Nova Scotia." Mr. Speaker, we're going to write 10 years of checks adding up to at least $100 million to a private company without any job guarantees. In fact, there will be no jobs as a result of that, Mr. Speaker. Why?
Order, please. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, pretty simple question. Why is the Premier now writing check after check after check to a private company with no job guarantees when he promised not to when he was running for the job?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think, Mr. Speaker, if I was in opposition to the previous government, it might have been a Conservative government I've been talking about, Mr. Speaker. But the reality of it is, Mr. Speaker, as the honourable member knows, the vessel that is being used in that run is an American vessel which has an American flag on it, and he also knows that requires an American crew to be on that vessel, Mr. Speaker. But it doesn't mean there will not be any Nova Scotians working on that vessel, Mr. Speaker. It doesn't mean, Mr. Speaker, that all of the jobs created in Yarmouth, Mr. Speaker, will be there for Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. It also means that the tourism operators across not only southwestern Nova Scotia, but indeed across this province, who've been encouraged by this operation, will be hiring Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. What we're seeing is a positive impact to the economy of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, and we are investing in our international link with our largest trading partner, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Transportation. The Minister wanted a cruise ferry on this route. He didn't get it. Presumably he wanted Nova Scotians crewing on the vessel. Didn't get that. Commercial trucks will not be permitted on this taxpayer-funded ferry, not because the boat can't accommodate them, but because the 9-member Portland City Council will not allow it. All this on a ferry that will cost taxpayers probably $100 million. So my question for the Minister is, how did the Minister allow Nova Scotia to get backed into a corner where Portland is dictating the conditions of the ferry service without contributing any money or taking any risk?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I did yoga last night, so I'm feeling good. I'm feeling very calm. I'm going to be relaxed. Not going to freak out. Mr. Speaker, look, the reality is that the opposition, the PCs, They're trying to frame this as a bad decision. They're trying to frame this as we're terrible negotiators. That's their play, Mr. Speaker. That's all they have. They're using a number, a fictitious number, forecasting it out 10 years, which is ridiculous, Mr. Speaker. They know that after the first 2 years of this agreement, we go back to negotiating, Mr. Speaker. This is a good deal because the people of Yarmouth, the region of Yarmouth, all Nova Scotians require this link with our largest trading partner, Mr. Speaker. This is good for our entire economy. It's good for the people. They're going to keep beating on it, Mr. Speaker, but then they'll go down in Yarmouth and pretend that they support it. It's got to be one or the other, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much.
The honourable member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, remarkably, the minister is selling tickets on a route.
Order, please. The honourable member for Pictou East has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Remarkably, the minister is selling tickets on a route despite not having permission to dock in Portland, and I can't even imagine how that happened. Now, we know what has been signed. The check's been signed. But I'm curious what else is left to be signed, and I'd like to ask the minister, can you tell the Nova Scotians whether all transportation permits for this route have been received or not?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Mr. Speaker, the process whereby the approvals have to take place through Portland, through the City of Portland, are very academic. This is what happens in government processes, Mr. Speaker. All the negotiations that have taken place since Mark McDonald and Bay Ferries have been on board have done so appropriately, Mr. Speaker. They've worked through the schedule. They've worked on the permitting. They've worked on the docking. All of those components that are part of this model, part of this plan. It's all in order, Mr. Speaker, because Mark McDonald, who is a reputable person, who is a leader in this industry, who that very party had a relationship with 7 years ago. They believed in him then, Mr. Speaker. Now, when they're looking for political points, they turn their guns on Mark McDonald. We're not backing down with Mark McDonald, and we're not backing down on Yarmouth, and we're not backing down on the people of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Wait times for community-based mental health services are on the rise. At the same time, the Minister of Health is trying to direct more people to such care. The Minister's own data shows that the average wait time for 90% of adults for the period from July to September 2013 was 75 days. The number increased to 105 days for the same period in 2015, Mr. Speaker. Under this minister and the Liberal government, community-based mental health services wait times have increased by 25%. This is unacceptable. Mr. Speaker, will the minister explain why under his watch community-based mental health services have increased wait times by 25%?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Pleased to rise my place and address this issue. The former Minister of Health knows that we're in a very early stages of a different model of care to create community capacity across Nova Scotia. That work now is under the direction of Dr. Linda Corey and the NSHA. In some parts of the province, we've actually reduced the wait times for mental health services. And what the member does know, of course, is that we do have 24/7 crisis line, mobile crisis line. We have our ERs where there, in fact, are also psychiatrists who can provide care within 24 hours.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The minister has some nice talking points about mental health and community-based mental health services, but the data is undeniable, Mr. Speaker. Nova Scotians are waiting. And, Mr. Speaker, we know with the amalgamation of the District Health Authority, it has had a negative effect on providing services, healthcare services, to Nova Scotians. And on average, an extra month under this minister for wait times have increased, Mr. Speaker, and this is needed in the community. These services are needed. They've made cuts in Pictou County, Mr. Speaker, that are not meeting demands and services. Yesterday, Mr. Speaker, the minister stated on the floor of this House that mental health services are stronger today than they were a year ago.
Does the member have a question?
I do, Mr. Speaker. The question to the minister: how can he stand behind that statement when increases in wait times have increased by 25%?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to say that one area in particular, when the former government was in office, they had a number of around 900 that needed youth mental health assessments at the IWK. We are now down to, at any one point in time, well less than 100 that need that service. And what I can tell the member about Pictou County is that today the mental health services are much stronger than a year ago.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Communications, Nova Scotia. On January 28th, his Deputy Minister sent a missive to civil servants advising them about their online activities. And unlike the email sent by the Minister of the day over a year earlier, this one talks about personal use of social media, even outside of work time. Mr. Speaker, the email says, in fact, and I'll just quote a small portion of it, some types of personal use can result in discipline up to and including dismissal if they are damaging to the government's reputation. Mr. Speaker, and I'll table that. Mr. Speaker, why is the government telling Nova Scotia civil servants they cannot speak out or have a view on public policy issues, even when the issues aren't in their own department?
The Honourable Minister of Communications, Nova Scotia.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. That's not the case at all. We entrust our deputy ministers to manage their staff appropriately. The deputy minister in this case did that when she, I believe, identified information that was circulating online that was not appropriate for a public servant to be posting, I believe.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Supreme Court of Canada in Osborne versus Canada has ruled that civil servants can participate in the political process and voice their opinions, and in fact it's protected by the Charter. Mr. Speaker, and the Minister is wrong that he's not saying that. I will table a minister from the Premier, or a letter from the Premier's staff to the Department of Environment where, quote, the staff person says about a civil servant, she hasn't demonstrated particularly good judgment with this post. And it's a post about an issue that has, in fact, it's about tuition hikes. It has nothing to do with the Department of the Environment. So, Mr. Speaker, my question is, why is the Premier's office, and in fact this is written by the Premier's now Chief of Staff, so why is the Premier's new Chief of Staff now the Facebook cop for civil servants?
The Honourable Minister of Communications, Nova Scotia.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. One thing I don't think any of us will do on this House is take recommendations on judgment from that member without question. We believe our Deputy Minister acts appropriately. We trust our staff. We support our public service, Mr. Speaker, and that's why we have such a good working relationship with them.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Nova Scotia's taxpayers were shocked to hear that they paid for $17,000 for a Liberal newspaper ad that apologized for their botched seniors pharmacare tax grab. And I'm sure they'd be equally shocked to hear that the minister whose department created and paid for the ad had only one word to say about it, and that was beautiful. So my question to the Minister of Communications, Nova Scotia, will the Minister share with the House exactly what was beautiful about using taxpayers' dollars on an attempt to fix a Liberal boondoggle?
The Honourable Minister of Communications, Nova Scotia.
Mr. Speaker, we have an obligation as government to communicate policy decisions to the public. Earlier in this question period, the Leader of the Opposition said, when are you going to tell seniors when you're going to be consulting with them? And now we have questions on when we advertise, Mr. Speaker. You know what? The fact that we took it upon ourselves to communicate to a large group of Nova Scotians that have been impacted by a policy, I think is beautiful, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Oh, but Mr. Speaker, that was only $17,000 to apologize for a whoopsie. Well, what about the bigger whoopsie, which was the $117,000 letter campaign that was sent around to seniors and the fact sheets apologizing once again? To this expenditure that would have funded the highest pharmacare premiums for 95 seniors for a year, the minister said, looks good to me if the PO is good. So for $117,000, the minister of CNS, that was a mail-out that you didn't have to do because the one was going to come out in a few weeks later when they talked about the premiums anyway, This government went and spent $117,000 when they didn't need to. How can seniors trust this government with their hard-earned tax dollars if the minister responsible so casually spends public dollars trying to fix what was obviously a political problem?
The Honourable Minister of Communications, Nova Scotia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I didn't expect the member from Argyle to step up and actually ask a question on the ferry, so I do appreciate this question. We are actually very proud of the fact that we took it upon ourselves to communicate with the public, Mr. Speaker, on a very critical...
Order, please. The Honourable Minister of Communications, Nova Scotia, has the floor.
We're very proud of the fact that we took it upon ourselves to communicate a very significant policy decision to the public and communicate with every single individual that could be impacted by it, Mr. Speaker. This government took it upon ourselves to support the most vulnerable citizens in our province who are having a difficult time accessing their pharmacare. There are too many people, Mr. Speaker, that are choosing between food and their meds. Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to stand behind a Premier and address that very significant problem in our society.
The Honourable Member for Colchester, Musqueam Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Seniors. Nova Scotia has an increasing number of seniors, obviously. The ratio of seniors to taxpayers is increasing at an alarming rate, and of course hospitals and support workers are overrun with the needs of the aging population. My question is, will the Minister of Seniors commit to maintaining funding for seniors in the budget?
The Honourable Minister of Seniors.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I think the member opposite, knows that indeed our commitment to seniors is strong. To get our new seniors, 1,000 a month now at 65 that are joining those ranks, and we are working to get them engaged in Nova Scotia in many different ways. We just held in Pictou a very, very successful economic seniors summit. And that's where we will drive and support seniors to be able to manage our programs in the future. And I think the member opposite will be pleased whenever our budget information comes forward.
The Honourable Member for Colchester, Musqueam Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One concern is the last Liberal budget saw a cut to the Department of Seniors by $366,000. Will the minister send a signal that this cut will not take place this year?
The Honourable Minister responsible for seniors.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I have every confidence that our Minister of Finance will deliver a strong budget on Tuesday, and hopefully the member opposite can wait until Tuesday of next week.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, last year, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada released their calls to action, a series of recommendations to be undertaken in order to redress the legacy of residential schools and advance the process of Canadian reconciliation. Of the 94 recommendations, 24 specifically call on provincial governments to take action. In December of 2015, I attended the event where the Premier made a commitment to some of education calls to action, which is a positive first step. But, Mr. Speaker, my question is, First Nations people are hoping for more commitments from the Premier. So what specific calls to action will be prioritized under this Premier?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. Serious issue, Mr. Speaker. I'm very proud of the fact the national government has made a tremendous effort to reach across First Nations communities across our country. We, as a province, have been leading the country with our tripartite arrangement, working with our Mi'kmaq community to ensure that First Peoples of this province, Mi'kmaq territories we stand in, is treated properly. I've made the commitment to our chiefs that we'll continue to develop the relationship that we have with them. I'm very proud of the fact that we are bringing treaty education to our public school education system, the first in the country, Mr. Speaker. Very encouraged by that. As I said that day, we're all treaty people. We just need to understand who made decisions on behalf of the Crown and what our roles and responsibilities are, and we're going to continue to make sure, Mr. Speaker, that the healing continues that has started through the Truth and and Reconciliation process.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission was established to uncover the truth about the residential school system, to inform all Canadians and to identify actions that needed to be taken. Issues within Indigenous communities are happening at this moment. In Nova Scotia, for instance, Mi'kmaq represent 21.5% of children in care, while persons of Indigenous ancestry represent just 2.7% of the total population. And just yesterday, there was a protest outside about non-consultation. So, Mr. Speaker, my question is, will the Premier commit today to implementing all of the provincial calls to action by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. I want to thank the Mi'kmaq communities across this province who have been very thoughtful and working extremely hard with our government to ensure that we continue to deal with the challenges facing them. The Minister of Community Services introduced a bill in the last session of the House talking about family and children services that specifically identified, Mr. Speaker, that specifically began to address the very issue that the member was talking about the alarming rate of Mi'kmaq children in care, Mr. Speaker. It goes back to ensuring that we develop a relationship with the community to ensure that those Mi'kmaq children remain in the community continues to provide the cultural and social experience, Mr. Speaker, in an environment that will allow those children to thrive. We're going to continue to work with our partners to continue with challenge after challenge, Mr. Speaker, and it can't go without saying how fortunate we are to have the leadership from the Mi'kmaq community in this province who've continued to work with successive governments of all political stripe to do right by their community and to deal with the long-term challenges, Mr. Speaker, that we will continue to do.
The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, on April 21st last year, I tabled a petition here in the legislature on behalf of people traveling the Deepdale Road in Inverness. It contained 212 signatures, and the residents cited safety risks because of the lack of maintenance. We know one of the reasons why our secondary roads are in such poor shape is because of the cut to the RIM rural road maintenance budget of 25% in each of the last 7 years. Mr. Speaker, some of our roads in Inverness County are in such poor condition from lack of maintenance that the Postal Service has discontinued service. Garbage trucks are not using those roads, Mr. Speaker. And last night I spoke with a school bus driver who said there's 50,000 kilometres on the bus, but there's hardly anything left to the life of that bus. Residents have arranged a protest. My question to the Minister, will he join me in a meeting with local residents on April 24th in Inverness?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Mr. Speaker, thanks to the member opposite for that question, and certainly I will if that's an opportunity. I don't know what day of the week that is, but if we're not in the legislature, it's a Sunday. Okay, yeah, sure. I'll take a drive up. I'll be there. Thanks.
The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I wasn't actually expecting that answer, but I'm very pleased that the Minister is interested in attending. Mr. Speaker, I think a lot of people feel that if we're not providing enough funding and maintenance to the roads each year, we're going to have an accumulation of neglect on those roads. And they're going to require not just maintenance, not just a few $1,000s of maintenance, but they're going to require actual reconstruction. And I believe that's the case with the Deepdale Road. So, Mr. Speaker, the problem with that is that the way the policy is currently set up, a lot of these roads can't make the capital planning list because they won't meet the $500,000 threshold. We have a budget coming up next week. What has the Minister done to prepare for that budget to ensure these roads can make the capital planning list for
the Honourable Minister of Transportation?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not sure about the 500,000 threshold. I don't know. I'll have to get back to the member on that. I'm not aware that that's a threshold that's in play. Mr. Speaker, and I said this yesterday in jest in response to a question, but I say it seriously. Every member has serious issues with some roads in their community. There's no doubt about that. From the gravel roads to those roads that are low volume, that are paving, that haven't had a new strip of paving in a long time. It's a challenge, Mr. Speaker, and the reality is that we are doing our very best. There is an infrastructure deficit that we're trying to address, and really it is a case by case, and we work with the local members and local stakeholders to get those needs addressed to the extent possible. But we are looking at a capitalized plan to do some of that work. work as opposed to having it in operations where the budget is stretched every year and maxed out early on in the fiscal season. Capitalizing some of those things may give us more opportunity to fix those. So it is a good point, and in the department we are working on that. Thank you.
The honourable member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, the Law Reform Commission of Nova Scotia has been instrumental in maintaining and strengthening our province's laws and legal system. It's an organization that members of the government certainly have valued in the past. I call to mind a comment from the member for Richmond, who said, and I quote, "I would like to take this opportunity to remind the Minister of Justice that as the budgetary process will inevitably begin in the upcoming spring, that I would hope the Minister of Justice will be a strong advocate for the Law Reform Commission to make sure they have adequate financing and possibly new financing to help them in some of the work they do." Well, Mr. Speaker, we now unfortunately know that the government plans to cut that funding in next week's budget. Mr. Speaker, how does the Minister of Energy, the member for Richmond, reconcile what he has said in this chamber in the past with this proposed elimination of funding?
The Honourable Minister of Energy. The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate the question from the member opposite. Many of you have received letters as well from all of the big law firms in the province asking for us to reconsider this, but I want to make several points. Number one, a full year was given to discussions with the Law Reform Commission asking them to find alternate sources of funding to ensure they keep their doors open. We do value their work, and we felt it was important to give them time to make changes and to think about it. And as well, we've also agreed to continue to have them located in the Department of Justice. So we're providing in-kind services and office and the technology support around that. So they have our support. We've asked them to find other sources of funding as well.
The honourable member for Inverness.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think this government should value their work. They should also support them. Mr. Speaker, we can look right now at the Powers of Attorney Act reform ideas that the Commission has put forward. That represents a value of about $300,000 in pro bono work by lawyers who are contributing freely to that process. Mr. Speaker, that would easily pay for the provincial one-third traditional commitment to the organization of $184,000. So, Mr. Speaker, the government should value their work and they should support the Law Reform Commission. Mr. Speaker, nobody in the legal community has suggested cutting funding to the Law Reform Commission. We look at their work in the past with enforcement of maintenance obligations. My question, with the member of Richmond, Mr. Speaker, being such a strong advocate in the past, why did the Minister of Justice decide to eliminate funding to this organization?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And again, just to reiterate for the member opposite, we've offered them in-kind support, which they currently have, but at present we're not going to provide them with other funding. So they needed to find other funding from other sources. And we offered, it was a proposal originally that we could cut it that very year, a year ago. We said, no, that's not right. Let's give them a year to make some changes and to find other sources of funding. And, we would welcome it if they're able to do so, but we are not able to increase or continue the level of funding they've had in the past. Thank you.
The Honourable In-House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to follow with the line of questioning of my friend in relation to the Law Reform Commission. So my question is to the Minister of Justice. The Commission, as we know, works to improve and modernize laws. In my meetings with many of the supporters from the legal community and from the commissioners themselves, they've determined that in excess of $300,000 in volunteer time is given to the Commission to assist us in modernize our antiquated legislation. Eliminating the funding to this democratic institution is unprecedented in our province's history. It provides us with
Does the member have a question?
Mr. Speaker, can the Minister of Justice explain how the Law Reform Commission was no longer a meaningful investment for Nova Scotians?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member opposite for raising the question again. As I said earlier, it is not a question of valuing the work that they do. This is a nice thing to have. It's been useful. There are some good reports that we've received over the years to every government, all of us. However, Mr. Speaker, it's important to note that very few provinces have a law reform commission, very few, and the federal government does not. And with that in mind, we felt that this is something that could be funded by other sources, and we will continue our commitment to provide space and the in-kind supports.
The Honourable In-House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
The Canada Law Reform Commission was cut, that's correct, by the Harper government, and our new federal government is currently looking at revisiting that. The Reform Commission of Nova Scotia is the perfect body for the rewriting of the cyberbullying law, a bill that all the members in this House, I believe, supported at one time, which was recently struck down. The Commission has the potential to draft the new cyberbullying law, and it can stand the test of time. So I asked the Minister, does she agree that the Commission would be the perfect candidate to conduct a review and rewrite of the cyberbullying law?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And what I do believe is that we will be consulting with the legal community. We've already reached out to a number of people who have positions on the Cyberbullying Act. We know that we'll be talking to the Canadian Bar and other legal entities and asking for their help in redrafting this. But we have a time frame as well. We want to be able to bring that in by the fall, and so it will be targeted consultation. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you will be to the Minister of Labour and Advanced Education. Recently, word was received about the closure of the Scotsburn plant in Sydney, a modern, efficient, well-run plant with 80 to 100 jobs that are very well paying for the Cape Breton community. Could the Minister share with this House and the workers what steps they are taking to save these very important jobs in Cape Breton, an area which already has chronic unemployment?
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I know this is a very difficult and stressful time for those employees. This is one of 3 plants that Saputo is closing across the country, and my thoughts go out to those families. Immediately upon getting the word that Saputo had planned this closure, Employment Nova Scotia staff reached out to the company and began working with the employees to assist them in whatever they need to find new positions in Cape Breton. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the answer, Minister. It's my understanding that the drivers who had worked at Scotsburn previously were let go, and they had to become jobbers, independent jobbers working there. And when they were let go, they were given 2 weeks of severance for every year that they had worked. These current employees who are being in production are only being offered 1 week severance for each week that they're working. And I'm also told when the combined income of the family is taken into consideration, they don't qualify for any type of help from the province of Nova Scotia when it comes to retraining. You know, one of the employees, Madam Minister, the night before he went in for this important meeting, he found out he was going to be a father, and the next day he was laid off. So then he finds out that there's no help from the province to get retraining.
Does the member have a question?
I sure do. The question is, what can this government tell that individual and the employees from that company what they can do to make sure that they have a job and are able to stay in Cape Breton, work in Cape Breton, and raise a family in Cape Breton?
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
I want to thank the honourable member for the question, and I do appreciate the concern that those workers must be feeling right now. Under the Skills Development Agreement, there are a variety of criteria. I would encourage anyone who has been displaced in this particular action to actually fill out an application. We have not received any applications yet. So there are a number of programs under the skills development that there are criteria that include income, but there are other programs that we offer as well. START, Apprenticeship START, Self-Employment, Job Creation Partnership. There's counseling and support available at our Careers Nova Scotia Centre. So there have been 4 sessions with the workers so far. We understand they're going well. There may be some concerns, but I urge them that if there are applications for any programs, that they in fact file them. And I'm happy to sit down with the member if there are any cases where he feels people are not getting appropriate support. Thank you.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Premier. Yesterday, the accounting firm PricewaterhouseCoopers produced an independent report on the economic benefits of the film industry, which showed, among other things, that it returned $7 to the province for every $1 it costs the government in the tax credit. I'd like to ask the Premier, did he or anyone in his staff or any government officials have prior knowledge of the contents of that report before it was released officially yesterday?
The Honourable Premier.
Thanks. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. No, I did not see that report. I believe there was a conversation with one of the members of Deputy Minister, Mr. Speaker. It was not a full briefing of the report. It's my understanding there were pieces of that report that were provided. It's also my understanding it is not something that Pricewaterhouse is actually considering and saying they're standing behind as an audited report. It's the information they had gathered from the industry and did a survey, Mr. Speaker, but I haven't seen it. What I can tell you is that we have a $10 million fund, Mr. Speaker. I encourage those in the film sector to apply for that fund, Mr. Speaker, and using the multiplier that they're using, Mr. Speaker, I look forward to that opportunity to continue to grow the sector and to be able to use the revenue to invest in the province of Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, we're talking about a report from an independent, respected accounting firm that shows that the film industry employs 3,200 people, or it used to employ 3,200 people, and generates $180 million in economic activity. I sure hope the Premier isn't suggesting that the accounting firm is walking away from a report which was released yesterday, because, Mr. Speaker, this is a very important industry. It's an economic driver. The government actually makes money from the economic contribution of the film industry. It's very important now that the report is in the public domain that the Premier take a look at it. He said yesterday he hasn't read it, but it wouldn't change his mind anyway. Just finish up today by asking him, will he now read the report and take a look at the benefits that the film industry brings to the province of Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to be very clear to all Nova Scotians. There is a fund for the film tax credit, and we are not going back to the old system.
That concludes the time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers. We'll now move on to government business. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, would you please call public bills for second reading?
We'll now call public bills for second reading.
Speaker, would you please call Bill number 149, the Mineral Resources Act?
We'll now call Bill number 149, the Mineral Resources Act. The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move that Bill number 149, the Mineral Resources Act, be read for a second time. Mr. Speaker, as the members will know, mining holds a long tradition in Nova Scotia. We've been exploring for and mining coal, gypsum, gold, and salt for more than 150 years. But even our well-established industries need modern, effective legislation which provides effective processes for industry